Hi again, I'm going to carry on reading our book, The Explorer. We read the first chapter and we left Fred and the other children in some sort of perilous situation, hadn't we? Something happened to the pilot and things were about to start going wrong. So there's some fab language in the first chapter, lots of really fantastic descriptive writing. And that's probably why I enjoy the book so much. So we're going to read chapter 2 because obviously this is me sharing a story with you, not giving you an English lesson. So chapter 2 is called The Green Dark. Fred wondered, as he ran, if he was dead. But he thought death would surely be quieter. The roar of the flames and his own blood vibrated through his hands and feet. The night was black. He tried to heave in a breath, to shout for help as he ran, but his throat was too dry and ashy to yell. He jabbed his finger into the back of his tongue to summon up some spit. "Is anyone there? Help! Fire!" he shouted. The fire called back in response. A tree behind him sent up a fountain of flames. There was a rumble of thunder, but nothing else replied. A burning branch cracked, spat red, and fell in a cascade of sparks. Fred leapt away, stumbling backwards into the dark and smacking his head against something hard. The branch landed exactly where he'd been standing seconds before. He swallowed the bile that rose in his throat and began to run again, faster and wilder. Something landed on his chin and he ducked, smacking at his face, but it was only a raindrop. The rain came suddenly and it came hard. It turned the soot and the sweat on his hands to something like tar, but at least it began to quench the fire. Fred slowed his run to a jog and then eventually to a stop. Gasping, choking, he looked back the way it came. The little aeroplane was in the trees. It was smoking, sending up clouds of white and grey into the night sky. He stared around, dizzy and desperate, but he couldn't see or hear a single human. Only the fern-like plants growing around his ankles and the trees reaching hundreds of feet up into the sky. The panicked dive and shriek of birds. He shook his head hard, trying to banish the shipwreck roar in his ears. The air on his arms was singed and smelt of eggs. He put his hand to his forehead. His eyebrow had charred and part of it came away in his fingers. He wiped it on the sleeve of his shirt. Fred looked down at himself. One leg of his trousers had been ripped away all the way up to his pocket, but none of his bones felt broken. There was vicious pain, though, in his back and his neck, and it made his arms and legs feel far off and foreign. A voice came suddenly from the dark. "Who's there? Get away from us!" Fred spun around, his ears still buzzing. He grabbed a rock from the ground and hurled it in the direction of the voice. He ducked behind a tree and crouched on his haunches, poised to jump or run. His heart sounded like a one-man band. He tried not to exhale. The voice said, "For God's sake, don't throw things." It was a girl's voice. Fred looked out from behind the tree. The light of the moon filtered deep green to the forest floor, casting long-fingered shadows across the trees, and he could see only two bushes, and they were both rustling. "Who is it? Who's there?" The voice came from the second bush. Fred squinted through the dark, feeling the remaining hair rise up on his arms. "Please don't hurt us," said the bush. The accent wasn't British. It was something softer, and the voice was definitely a child's, not an adult's. "Was it you throwing poo?" Fred looked down at the ground. He'd snatched up pieces of year-old, fossiled animal dung. "Oh," he said. "Yes." He was becoming accustomed to the dark and could see the shine of eyes peering out from the grey-green gloom of the undergrowth. "Are you from the plane? Are you hurt?" "Yes, we're hurt. We fell out of the sky," said one bush. The other one said, "No, we're all right, thanks." "You can come out," said Fred. "It's only me here." The second bush parted, and Fred's heart gave a great leap. Both the girl and her brother were covered in scratches, burns and ash. and that had mixed with the sweat and rain and made a kind of paste on their faces, but they were alive. He wasn't alone. "You survived," he said. "Obviously we did," said the first bush, "or we would be less talkative, wouldn't we?" The blonde girl stepped out into the lashing rain. She stared from Fred to the other two, unsmiling. "I'm Con," she said. "It's short for Constantina, but if you call me that, I'll kill you." Fred glanced at the other girl, and she smiled nervously. "Right," he said. "If you say so. I'm Fred." "I'm Lila," said the second girl. She held her brother on her hip. "And this is Max." "Hi." Fred tried to smile, but it made the cuts on his cheeks stretch and burn, so he stopped and made do with a grin that only involved the left half of his face. Max was at the breathless stage of crying, and he clung to his sister so tightly that his fingers were pressing bruises on her skin. She was leaning over to one side to hold him up, shaking with the effort. They looked, Fred thought, like a two-headed creature, arms entwined. "Is your brother badly hurt?" he asked. Lila patted her brother desperately on the back. "He won't talk, he's just crying." Con looked back towards the fire and shivered. The flames cast a light on her face. She was no longer blonde. Her hair was grey with soot and brown with blood, and she had a scratch on her shoulder that looked really deep. "Are you all right?" Fred asked, wiping rain out of his eyes. "That cut looks bad." "No, I'm not all right," Con spat. "We're lost in the Amazon jungle, and statistically speaking, it's very likely that we're going to die." "I know." Fred didn't feel he needed reminding. "I meant..." "So no," Con's voice grew thin and high. "I think it would be safe to say that none of us are all right. Not at all, not even slightly." The bushes rustled. The rain hammered down on Fred's face. "We need to find some shelter," he said. "A big tree or a cave or something that would..." "No!" Max had given a sudden scream, a yell that was wet with spit and fear. Fred stepped backwards, raising his hands. "Don't cry. I just thought..." Then his eyes followed Max's pointing finger. There, just 3 inches from Fred's shoe, was a snake. It was speckled brown and black, patchwork to match the jungle floor, and its head was as big as a fist. For 1 second, nobody breathed. The jungle waited. Then Max let out a second scream that dug deep into the night, and the 4 of them turned and fled. The ground was sodden, and they ran pell-mell, sending up mud into one another's eyes and grazing their elbows against trees. Fred ran as if his body were not his own, faster than he'd ever run before, palms stretched ahead of him. He tripped over a root and turned a full somersault, coming up spitting earth. He ran on. The rain blinded him and shadows flashed past him in the darkness. There was a yell behind him. "Please, Max," said Lila. Fred turned back, skinned in the mud. "He won't run." Lila bent over her brother. "And I can't carry him." The little boy lay on his back, weeping up at the sky, his whole body shaking in the driving rain. "Come on." Fred heaved Max over his shoulder. The boy was far heavier than he'd expected, and he screamed as Fred lifted him, but Fred grabbed both of Max's knees and started running, his whole body screaming with pain. He could hear Lila, her feet thumping close behind them. The stitch in Fred's side was almost unbearable when he tore out of the trees and into a sudden clearing. He halted, and Max bumped his head against Fred's spine and yelled. Angrily, he tried to bite one of Fred's shoulder blades. "Please don't," said Fred, but he was barely paying attention to the boy on his back. He stared, stunned, looking ahead of him. They were standing at the edge of a wide circle of trees, open to the sky and lit by the fat moon. There was a carpet of green moss and grass, and the stars above them were clustered so thickly that the silver outnumbered the night. Fred lowered Max to the ground and stood, bent over, hands on thighs, panting. "Did the snake chase us?" said Max. "No," gasped Con. "How do you know?" wailed Max. Lila dropped to her knees, clutching at her side. "Snakes don't, Maxie. We both know that. I just panicked, said Con. Her voice was bitter. That's what happened. See, look, no snakes. We were stupid and now we're even more lost. The ground in the clearing sloped slightly towards a large puddle of water. Fred crossed over to it, muscles aching, and he sniffed. The water smelt of rotting things, but he was very thirsty. He took a tiny sip, but immediately spat it out. It's no good, he said. It tastes like a dead person's feet. But I'm thirsty, said Max. Fred looked around the clearing, hoping to find water before Max started crying again. If you wring out your hair, he said, there'll be water in it. And he tugged his dark fringe down over his forehead and twisted it. A few drops fell onto his tongue. It's better than nothing. Max chewed on his hair for a second, then scrunched his eyes closed. I'm scared, he said. It was said without whining, just as a simple matter of fact, and somehow it was worse than the tears. I know, Lila said softly. We all are, Maxie. She crossed to her brother and pulled him close to her. His small bony fingers crossed over a burn on her wrist, but she didn't push him away. She began to whisper in his ear in Portuguese, something soft, almost a song like a lullaby, and they were both shaking slightly. Fred swallowed. All this will look less bad in the morning, he said. Will it? Said Con. There was bite to the question. Will it? Really? Well, it can't look much worse, he said. Once it's light, we'll be able to work out a way to get home. Con looked hard at him. There was challenge in the look, and Fred stared unblinking back at her. Her face was all geometry, sharp chin, sharp cheekbones, sharp eyes. What now then? She said. Our Mama and Papa say, began Lila. The mere mention of her parents had made her face crease and crumple, but she swallowed and went on. They always say you need to sleep before you think. They say when you're exhausted you do stupid things, and they're scientists, so he should sleep. And Fred found his old body was aching. Good, fine, let's sleep. He lay down on his side where he stood in the wet grass. His clothes were soaked through, but the air was warm. He closed his eyes. Perhaps he would wake up in his bed at school, he thought, next to the snoring of his roommates, Jones and Scrace. An ant crawled over his cheek. But aren't we supposed to stay awake in case we die of concussion, said Con. I think if we got concussion we'd be dizzy, said Lila. Fred, already half asleep, tried to work out if he was dizzy, and the world began to spin away from him. If we all die in the night, I'm blaming both of you, said Con. And it was on that cheery thought that Fred felt himself dropping down, down away from the jungle and the thick night air and into sleep.